Managing Director of Political Analysis, South Africa. Good morning to you and welcome to AM News.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's start off with the very first question, that peace deal that has been signed by Alfonso Dhlakama, but he's still in hiding. Where does this leave the peace deal as it stands?
Well, as it stands right now, one would assume that they're still battling it out. And a lot has been made about the peace deal being what will bring Renamo to the party and, of course, bring stability or greater stability in Mozambique. But then if we look at the discourse and certainly how Alfonso Dhlakama's Renamo has been over the years, it's basically about militancy. So basically to remove that tool that this party has been using consistently now since the 90s would effectively mean there is no political strategy there. And of course, if elections are to be held and of course, if any stability is to be formed, it basically nullifies the basic tool of participation, which has been, in the main, violence and reprisals in some parts of Mozambique.
What is your sense? Why do you think Alfonso Dhlakama is still in hiding, though?
Well, there are no guarantees. And as I say, Renamo has used this as a tool for their participation. And of course, if you do ratify the peace deal and you do come out into the open, that means that you tacitly agree to the process and therefore you cannot rescind on it. So basically, from that angle, one could see why there could be vested interest on his part.
So are you suggesting perhaps that we won't see free and fair elections in Mozambique?
Well, to expect them to be free when the environment is characterized by violence, it's only last year that a peace deal was signed. And of course, it doesn't mean that there hasn't been spate of violence in parts of Mozambique, which are, being pinned on Renamo. And as I said, it's their way of participation. For the longest time, the party has been facing, I would say, a crisis of legitimacy, from the older liberation types like Dhlakama, who are now finding themselves being contested by the younger types who want to participate in a democratic process, one that does not embrace violence. So the party and perhaps Mozambican politics are at a crossroads in that sense, because it's saying, well, we're moving past from this and we need to have parties that follow the democratic process.
Mzoxolo, let's look at the broader SADC region for that matter. During the SADC meeting in Zimbabwe, President Robert Mugabe, who's heading SADC right now, boasted that the SADC region is the most stable in Africa. But we know there's undercurrents with what's happening in Mozambique and also in Lesotho over the weekend. Can we still say the same thing?
Well, I would say SADC is more stable than the other regions. So, for instance, if you look at West Africa and you look at the Horn of Africa, yes, there is an argument there, one that is solid. But what it means is that there is peace in SADC, but that peace is rather short-lived. All it needs is just one incident in Lesotho, for instance, or that one incident in Madagascar, in Mozambique. So basically, it seems that, yes, in the current political space, it seems to be stable, but it only takes that one trigger and basically have the whole region back to some form of anarchy.
Now, what is the SADC Troika, Peace and Security Department on matters of unrest, the witness like we did now over the weekend in Lesotho? What is their role, so to speak?
Well, their role basically is to seek stability. One, of course, that does not embrace more confrontational forms. So you don't expect the deployment of troops, for instance. You want a more diplomatic approach. So that is primarily their approach to solving the impasse in Lesotho. But in the main, if it doesn't address, of course, you'd recall that there was the impending vote of no confidence that was deferred later when Parliament was, of course, the whole thing was disintegrated. So basically, it means that that undercurrent is still there. And of course, SADC has always emphasized this diplomatic approach, this peaceful approach. But if it doesn't deal with that basis for the conflict, there was going to be a vote of no confidence, and it's likely that Thabane would have been out. And if that is not addressed, you will still continue to have this.
What do you make of weekend reports that suggest that South Africa sent SANDF special forces to Lesotho to whisk the Prime Minister, Tom Thabane, out of the country before his house was besieged by the Lesotho army officers?
Well, of course, I do not have intel that points to that, but I wouldn't put it past the South African government. Of course, South Africa is the hegemon there. South Africa's vested interests there. But of course, the South African government has come to deny all of this and say, well, no, he fled with his own free will, and the only escort we're providing is now in Lady Brand. But as a hegemon, I wouldn't put that past them, at least the South African Special Forces.
Do you think that SADC has acted quickly enough in this particular case? Because apparently there's crisis meetings being held in Pretoria as we speak.
Yeah, that's what you need. You want a rapid response system, not only just on the military front, but also on the diplomatic front. And I think the manner in which they've gone about it is fairly swift. But as I say, you know, sometimes when you're too swift with your response, you may overlook more sustainable solutions to the conflict. And of course, let us not look only the incident over the weekend. We need to look at it in the grander scope of things and look at the greater picture of stability in Lesotho.
And not just in Lesotho, in the SADC region. Let's talk about that. Your sense of the entire peace and security. Like you said, there is undercurrents, that the entire SADC region is not as stable. There's one little thing that can maybe put a match to that flame, and it could be catastrophe for the region, so to speak. Yes,
and of course, again, you know, politics is cyclical. And each cycle has its own challenges, and we need to understand that in SADC. Yes, most of the countries in SADC do not have that cyclical conflict or conflict as a tool of participation, as we alluded to in Mozambique. But in the main, it's about addressing poverty in the region. And so long as you have those pockets, you have pockets for greater resistance, greater instability.
Mr. Mpolase, thank you so much for your time and joining us here on AM. That was Mzoxolo Mpolase, the Managing Director of Political Analysts South Africa, talking to us about the peace deal between Frelimo and Renamo in Mozambique, as well as the weekend, almost a coup in Lesotho. We'll explore that story a little bit later.